Associate Justice on the Minnesota Supreme Court from your neighboring state. One of your bankruptcy judges, Chuck Nail, was a law partner of mine for many years, so I got to hear all about the wonders of South Dakota. He's very fond of your home state. In any event, I have had a 20-year plus affiliation with this program, first as a assistant coach for a team from Hutchinson, Minnesota, and then now as a judge in the national competition. And I've done that now much of the last, 15, 20 years or so. And I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to be with you here today. I'm thrilled that you put in all the effort and are willing to engage in this virtual discussion. We'd all prefer to be in person, but we're going to make this work and we're going to turn it into an opportunity. And I'm thrilled to be with you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Teena Gabrielson. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming, also nearby. I teach political philosophy, courses like American Political Thought, and I've twice been a state We the People judge here in Wyoming, and this is my first time serving at the national level. It's been a real treat, and I'm looking forward to one more exciting session today. Tandy, you're on mute.
Am I still on mute?
Nope, we can hear every word.
Thank you. Hi, then hello again. My name is Tandy McConnell. For 20 years, I was professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina. Then about 3 years ago, I decided to do something harder and decided to become an 8th grade teacher. And remember your 8th grade year. How nice were you to your teacher in your life? I don't know, how nice are you to your teachers now that you're in high school? But I've been working with We the People for 15 or 20 years. I forget how long as well, but I've seen the program change and develop, and it's just always been one of the highlights of my year to be part of this and be a chance to hang out with guys like you. Would you introduce yourselves, please?
Makenna DuPont.
Colter Huseby.
Gabrielle Pruitt.
Charlie Waugh.
And would you introduce your teachers?
Our teacher is Mr. Gainey.
Yes.
Helpfully standing there in front of the 4 dead presidents.
And the state coordinator is Wes Brown.
Well, very good. Well, let's get down to business, shall we? We're Unit 1 judges. We're interested in the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system. We're asking question 3. Aristotle asserts in the Politics that it is not the form of government ruled by the one, the few, or the many that matters most, but rather the ends of government that are most important. Where in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution did the framers set forth the ends of government? How did the framers differ, if at all, about the ends of government, about how the ends of government should be prioritized? Which of the ends of government set forth in the Declaration and Constitution appear to have had the highest priority today? Please begin.
The time of our government's creation was incredibly tumultuous for the founders and those who lived through the Revolutionary era. The founders had seen how a corrupt government could affect its people and wanted to do everything in their power to stop that from happening again. They realized, however, that they wouldn't always be around, and that over time, governments change. With this in mind, they set forth a specific plan for the function of the United States government and ultimately the ends of that government. The Declaration of Independence is perhaps the best source to look at when looking for the ends of government. The founders saw the absolute necessity of a government that acknowledges and respects its citizens' natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If a government refused its citizens those rights or became destructive, they wrote that it was not only the people's right, their duty to alter and abolish it and to institute new government, which would better protect their rights. It made it clear that the government was only to exist through the consent of its citizens. This directly ties to the preamble, which states, "We the people of the United States do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America," implying that it is the people who give the power to their government and therefore have the ability to take that power back. In the end, they strive to prevent the long train of abuses which have been inflicted upon them by the British government, and the Declaration and Constitution are direct results of that. The entire amendment process set forth by the Constitution is an attempt to secure the government from these ends and still be able to adapt over time to a changing social and political landscape.
This, however, does not mean that the creation of the Constitution was entirely unanimous and without debate. The framers, when creating the government, all had very differing opinions on which ends to prioritize. After all, according to Aristotle, quote, "a man is a political animal," end quote. The main contention of debate between the framers was the importance of personal security or societal security, directly being correlated into classical republicanism and natural rights. Classical republicanism maintained a main focus on civic virtue and the common good, while the natural rights approach believed in individualism more mainly. These two ideologies can be seen in the preamble. General welfare and the blessings of liberty proposed themselves to be the most divisive within the populations of the framers. The general welfare appeals towards the classical republicanism side of things, in which the blessings of liberty fall in the aspects of natural rights, thus promoting individualism. For example, Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay all prioritized the individualistic portions of the ends of government, while Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, and Richard Henry Lee, on the contrary, prioritized self-sacrifice for the greater good.
In the United States today, the government has to prioritize specific ends while putting others on the back burner. During different periods, we see different ends being prioritized. During the Great Depression, the government prioritized social welfare over the freedoms of citizens and implemented many welfare items to help the general welfare of the nation. We saw something similar following the 9/11 attacks when President Bush implemented many acts that intruded on freedoms for added security. Now, the government is divided along party lines on whether they value the freedoms and rights of individuals or the general public's welfare and security. Changing circumstances every day lead to different prioritization among the government. It is hard to nail down just one, and that is put as the most important by the government due to the many opinions and circumstances.
As both internal security and personal rights and freedoms go, the current pandemic is an excellent example of citizens using their rights, such as the First Amendment. Riots in Colorado have shown both sides exercising their rights to freedom of speech. Things like this are happening all across the continental US. Looking at that, it would seem that the local public seems to value their rights above public safety, but the government, in their attempts to handle the COVID crisis, are prioritizing general welfare and internal order above the right for citizens to leave their homes to protect the communities. Local and federal governments each have their own ends to prioritize, and with state diversity growing ever present, elections, economic legislation, and the public's health will take the toll for the current crisis. As ends of government goes, different scenarios require different priorities for the government, but throughout US history, the ends of government have been to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We are now ready for questions.
And very good. Well, let's get down to business, shall we? Let's go back to Aristotle for just a moment. As Aristotle was talking about the goal of government and the goal of life, he used a Greek word, eudaimonia, which we use to translate as the good life. It could mean good spirit, perhaps more literally. And then Jefferson, perhaps taking that idea, talks about the pursuit of happiness. Are those the same thing? Can we assume that the good life of the individual and the good life of the community are the same thing, or can they be in conflict with each other? And which is the government, which end of government was Aristotle pushing us towards?
I think what Aristotle was trying to poke at here was the overall well-being of the general populace, not just the individual.
I think that when you look at how people like the good life and for like the individual versus like a good community, like civic virtue, I think that in times they can work hand in hand, and that the good of the individuals is what's good for the community. But I think oftentimes they do tend to butt heads in circumstances that we can see today.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, I have another question for you. Going to move in a slightly different direction. Okay. For the founders, one of the ends of a federal republic is to avoid the most common faction, that between the rich and the poor. How effective has the US Constitution been in this regard?
I think we see a lot of political polarization, especially in that front, where we have a very large wage gap and income gap between the two classes. And current politicians are running on issues like taxing the rich to lower that wage gap. So I don't think the Constitution entirely covered that, and it left it more up to the current government to implement what they saw fit.
I'd have to agree with her. Oh,
Go ahead,
okay.
Colter.
Okay, thank you. I'd have to agree with my teammate Bree. I feel like that the Constitution kind of tried setting that forward, but didn't really know which way the government was going to go forth, and therefore they had to kind of keep it in the broader scheme of things, which in the end actually opened up the opportunities of what she mentioned before, of the polarization of the political entities and parties, in which created even bigger wage gaps and which ones they should prioritize, therefore creating a little bit more conflict than I think they originally intended to.
I want to take a little different approach to this question. I think that our Constitution hasn't really been tested on the true value it has against this class conflict, because throughout the history of the United States, we've had different conflict more as an internal society. We've had more of a conflict on race and ethnicity, and at some points even religion, that it's hard to see as much contention among classes as we saw among those other things. And I think as time goes forward and we become more of a colorblind society, we'll see more of the Constitution being used against class divisions more than racial and ethnic divisions.
So let's go back to Aristotle. And I would like to ask you a question about the progressive era reforms that began about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit before that, with the focus on initiative, referendum, and recall. Would Aristotle have approved of those reforms, or would he have disapproved of those reforms? Why or why not? If you think about those reforms for a minute, you know, initiative is the ability to put a policy question before the voters for the voters to decide. Referendum is an opportunity for the voters to say, we don't like what the legislature passed. And recall is typically thought as a way of, for example, in my case, the Minnesota Constitution has a provision for recalling judges, very, very infrequently used. But so when you think about those kinds of, the way those kinds of things would work, would Aristotle favor those or disfavor them?
I think that he would favor them, especially looking at what is in the beginning of our question, that rule by the one or the few, not the many, matters most, but rather the ends of government. And knowing that the framers sought for the ends of government to be more about the people, that I think that he would approve of the people being given the chance to use their voice if the government is doing something that isn't good.
I respect Makenna, but I have to respectfully disagree with her. I think that Aristotle was afraid of the tyranny of the majority, and that he felt that if the people had too much power, that it would be overrun and the government would not be able to function as well.
Fine.
Very good. Well, thank you.
Timing worked out just right there. Well, are you guys as exhausted as we are at the end of a long day? I'm sure have you done, how many of these have you done today? I mean,
this was just our only one, I believe.
My only one today.
Well, this is our, what, 7th one for the day, and
8th.
yesterday.
But who's counting?
We get to sit down and do the math. So, but I feel like we ended on a very high note. This was a lot of fun, a great discussion. Put it in terms of class conflict is a daring but really important way to do that. I'm not sure I agree entirely with your interpretation there, but it is a solid and meaningful interpretation and I'm trying to look back at some of the other notes that I took. You discussed a very complicated, very important issue about what's the purpose here? Why are we supposed to have government in the first place? And you put it in terms that we could all understand. So thank you so much for doing that.
I appreciate your work today too. In your presentation, I liked how you talked really specifically about the ways in which the ends of government become prioritized by the context and the times, what the specific conditions of any moment demand in terms of 911 and Bush's response in the executive position versus today, and then the emphasis on protest and the individual rights of assembly and freedom of speech at the end, I thought was an interesting way to conclude that section. And so I thought you did a nice job. I also liked the way that you kind of stacked your understanding of classical republicanism, the general good, the emphasis on general welfare and the Constitution, and likewise on the natural rights side. So those were real strengths in your presentation, and I enjoyed our back and forth and conversation too.
So the question that I asked about Aristotle is, it's a, I mean, I think you can argue it in a couple of different ways, but I thought the response that the last member of the team made relative to Aristotle would be quite skeptical of initiative, recall, and referendum. I think the writings of Aristotle support that outcome more than they support any other outcome. Now that, and what I think, that and $10 buys you coffee somewhere. You get to make up your own mind about this. But I thought the analysis of it was quite good, and I very much enjoyed it. And the other thing that I noted here, you were talking a little bit about, in response to the question that my colleague asked about the class distinction, rich versus poor. The point you made there about policy versus constitutional language, that maybe the founders left that question more to the public and to the body politic than perhaps was wise, or perhaps than they intended. I think that's actually a pretty good point. There are a lot of decisions that courts get to make, and many times, and I can tell you in my 20 years as a judge, first on the Court of Appeals and then on the Supreme Court, several times a year I'm writing an opinion that says the lawyers raise all kinds of great questions about what the policy should be. The legislature has decided to go a certain direction, and in the absence of any direct constitutional language that prohibits it, we're not going to interfere with legislative priorities. That's part of that whole separation of powers thing. So there's a really powerful point lurking underneath the point that you made here. And it's something that we haven't heard much of today. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today to discuss these issues.
Good job.